I'm not saying this is what is going to sound great. I'm just trying to look at what's going to deal with that EQ, take a nice narrow band and knock out some of that 7, 8K range. That's not going to be the first frequency to feedback again. See, now it's happening a little bit lower. So I actually can widen that out. And now I'm able to turn that fader all the way up.
Where do you see it happening?
I was just seeing it. Ooh, hang on. I'm trying to gain up. Turn that back off. See where I was just seeing that single band of that frequency going up?
Yeah.
I can also turn this offset up and make this essentially this graph louder or larger so I can see that stuff even easier.
There it is.
So I can see exactly the frequency at which that feedback is occurring, and I can go cut a bit. So it really wants to happen in both of those, so I put a little high shelf there. And now it's wanting to feedback the low frequency. So it's a great tool to be able to see at what frequency am I dealing with feedback? Because like where most sources on the stage, you shouldn't have to do this kind of work and say, well, where does it want to feedback and go cut it according to that. But things like a pastor's mic, that's going to be like the thing that's more sensitive to feedback because you're going to be, it's a smaller microphone element further away and it's not as loud of a source and all those kinds of things. That's the stuff where then being able to take this and see where the feedback is happening and go use your EQ to notch those things so that you can get more gain out of that signal without it. So there's kind of two uses of the EQ. There's using EQ as a tool to just shape how a signal sounds. And then there's using EQ for things like that where it's like, I'm literally just trying to prevent what wants to feedback. So I'm making the sacrifice of not necessarily EQing it to how it sounds great, but I'm EQing it to where I can get it loud enough. So as long as you have to do a little bit of both and kind of play between the two to get to where you can do what you need to with that. Does that make sense?
In most circumstances, do you find yourself notching out EQs, adding to EQs, or is it just that subjective and circumstantial?
It is. I always like to start by taking away what I need less of and make that my first step. And but then a lot of times I'll be both cutting and adding in the same EQ. So
do you typically start from flat, just straight up flat, no?
Yep.
And go from there.
Totally. I always like to start from flat and just tinker from there.
There was one question, if we can go back just a little bit.
Yeah.
You said the 2.5 is your go-to for starting, and where would the threshold be then?
I don't have a starter threshold. It's literally because that's so dependent on the gain coming from that source.
Okay.
Where the ratio is something where it's kind of fixed. The threshold then going to determine like how hard that ratio is actually going to hit. Because if I have a 2.5, but then I'm at my threshold crazy low, I'm still going to overcompress it. I can still overcompress a signal at 2.5 if I'm being really really heavy with the threshold. I just like the sound of that, knowing that if I hit where it's just taking the top off in that compressor, 2.5 is going to be a fairly smooth amount of removal that I'm not going to hear a whole lot of. So it's one of those things that's still super dependent. That's why I can have at least a ratio that I like to start with, but the ratio has to be the piece that's the unknown variable. I can't have, if I knew both variables, then I'd have to know exactly how loud the signal was and where the gain set and all those kinds of things to be able to have that precise of an answer. Any EQ questions? Bueller. So the one thing I'll say there is people get scared of EQ because it's super subjective, and there's times where it's like not. I mean, I still say there's sometimes like I don't know what this needs. Sometimes you just play around with it. Sometimes it's the thing. One thing I would encourage is it can be a lot of times if a source doesn't sound great, our first thing to go to is the EQ. But I always like to stop and check myself and say, do I actually just need to go adjust something at the microphone? Like, is the microphone pointed the right direction? Like, where's the real problem of why the source doesn't sound good? And EQ is a great tool to help clean things up and just, lift, like take a vocal microphone and just cut out a little bit of what's detracting about that person and the combination of that person and that microphone, and just find what I need less of or more of to get them to sound like themselves. But for things like a guitar amp, like if it doesn't sound good, other than use filters to say narrow how much of that guitar I'm actually hearing so it fits in the mix, but I also may say, man, I just feel like the guitar doesn't sound great. Is it a problem of what pickup the guitar player's using? Is it a problem of where the mic is placed on a guitar amp. So I like to just make sure I'm getting a good sound at the source to start with, and then I'm using EQ to tweak from there a little bit to get where I want to be. So,
Is there a way to store on this board people's EQs? Like,
you absolutely
Difference.
can. You
Okay.
can. There's a library right there that you can tap on, and it's got a bunch of built-in things that are in there, and you can add
Okay.
tons of other EQ presets. But
this
like
is
I
Mitch
said,
with a cold. This is Mitch normal. This is
and see, but this is that goes to my whole thing of what I was saying earlier. Like where it's there, it's available to you.
Certain microphones
I don't like it. I don't like doing that.
Yeah.
Because then I get out of the habit of actually doing the work myself.
Right.
If I'm just recalling the preset of what worked last time, I like to make myself work for it. But that doesn't mean that's the right call for everyone. So it's
Yeah.
totally there. It's an option. It's there as a tool that you can use. I just want to make sure you guys are also not relying on that, but also
right.
learning how to do it yourself.
So that can be done individually with individual channels and not necessarily a scene where you got everything.
Yes, correct.
Oh, wow.
So there's multiple kinds of libraries. There's the library within each of those devices. So I can go in here and I can store just an EQ library. If I go into Dynamics, I can store a Dynamics library. And then up here, there's a library which is just a channel library. So that's where you save all the parameters of that whole channel. Gain, compressors, EQs, where it's going mix-wise. So you could save everything on a channel using just the generic channel library. So you can do a ton of that doesn't have to be related to a scene that's going to recall everything. It can just be recalling all those individual parameters for a channel. But I want you to use the tools. So I'm just going to come back to that because it's important.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I want you to learn how to get to the end result without having to. Now, if you cheat and recall that and go and look at that and look at what's happening there, and then you back those EQ filters off to 0 and say, oh, I hear why that filter is there. Like, just as long as you're using those tools to learn and not just to know, oh, if I recall that preset, it sounds good, then I don't have to worry about it. As long as you're still engaging with it and playing with the things and pushing the buttons and figuring out why those filters are there, that can be beneficial. I just don't want you to lose that piece of, like, playing with the actual functions of it.
Can you look at just the lines of an EQ and know that that's wrong? That's going to be bad.
No.
Okay.
Like, depending if I know what the source is, if I know what microphone it is, and I know all the variables, and I look at something, sometimes I can say that's probably going to sound bad.
Yeah.
But I always like to joke that in the end, what matters is how does it sound. So if
Yeah.
it looks wrong but it sounds great, I don't care. Like, I've done
Right.
some EQs that have looked really, really weird, but they sounded great. And
Yeah.
so I sometimes I can look at it and know because of just if it's a console that I know and a room that I know and mics that I know and people that I know where I would land on that person usually. But I also may look at that and go, well, that's weird. Let's turn it up and see how it sounds. And if it sounds great, it may be great. If it sounds awful, it may be awful.
Yeah.
Okay.